The first sound I remember from that night wasn't the music or the laughter. It was the scrape of a fork against china, sharp and deliberate, followed by my dad's voice cutting through the noise. "Excuse me," he said to the host beside him, pointing in my direction. "Could someone tell the staff not to stand near the family photos?" Every head turned. I froze mid-step, my hand still holding the small box I'd wrapped that morning, a pen with his initials engraved. The kind of gift a daughter gives a man she still calls dad in her head. For a split second, I thought he was joking. Then Vivian laughed. Not the light kind of laugh, but the slow, syrupy one she used when she wanted people to notice her pearls. "Oh, Richard," she said, "she's just trying to help." Her daughter Chloe followed with a whisper loud enough to carry. "In that dress, please. She looks like a catering person." The room erupted in soft, polite laughter, the kind people use when they're not sure what's safe to find funny. I stood there, my cheeks burning while the champagne shimmered in their glasses. He didn't correct them. He didn't even look at me. I took a slow breath, forced my hand to lower the gift to the corner of the dessert table, and smiled at no one. The music swelled again, masking the silence between us. I told myself to remember this feeling, the sting, the weight in my chest, because it would be the last time he'd ever make me feel small. That was the night my dad called me staff at his own retirement party. And that was the night I decided to let him finish his celebration before I ended it my way. The ballroom at the Marlowe Hotel gleamed like a diamond showpiece. Gold drapes, champagne towers, a jazz quartet playing songs from the 80s. Everything about it screamed success, but it didn't smell like celebration to me. It smelled like money trying too hard to disguise guilt. I'd arrived 15 minutes early, thinking I could hand him the gift quietly, maybe share a private word before the crowd. Instead, I'd been mistaken for an event coordinator and told to check the centerpieces. I hadn't corrected them. Not yet. My name wasn't on the family table. It wasn't anywhere near it. Vivian had taken that seat months ago, along with everything else that used to belong to my mom. The lake house, the china, the spot next to him, and every framed photo on display. My mom's face had been edited out of most of them, literally. There was one picture from my graduation where her shoulder was visible, half-cropped as if she were just another guest who'd wandered too close. I moved along the photo wall, pretending to admire the montage, my reflection ghosting over theirs. He looked happy in every shot. Wealthier, younger, lighter. As if erasing me had shaved years off his life. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the same one I'd carried since the funeral 7 years ago when he showed up, late hand in hand with Vivian, claiming they'd been friends from the foundation. She was wearing Mom's perfume that day. I never forgot the smell. When the MC began announcing his achievements, 30 years of leadership, innovation, community service, I drifted toward the back of the room. The catering staff smiled at me as if I belonged with them, maybe in a way I did. Richard Kennedy, founder of Kennedy & Vail Financial Philanthropist Mentor. The words rolled off the stage like gospel. They forgot to mention narcissistic parent. He'd built the company with the same iron hand he'd used at home. Control every detail, own every narrative, punish every deviation. I'd learned young that speaking up only meant being told to be grateful for the roof over your head. I stayed quiet, but I watched everything. That's what people underestimate about quiet daughters. They forget how much we see. From my corner, I could see Vivian adjusting her diamond brooch while Chloe took selfies beside the company logo. My dad's laughter echoed across the hall. It was the laughter of a man who'd rewritten his story and convinced himself it was true. When the speeches began, I stayed near the catering team. A young waiter offered me a glass of champagne. I shook my head and smiled. "I'm working tonight," I said softly. He nodded, not realizing how true that was. The speeches dragged on, executives praising his vision, partners thanking his mentorship. Each word felt rehearsed, paid for, the kind of adoration that comes with bonuses and stock options. Then came Vivian's turn. She walked to the podium in a silver gown, the kind of glitter meant to blind rather than shine. "Richard," she began, voice trembling just enough to sound heartfelt. "You've built not just a company, but a legacy for our family, our family." I felt the words slide under my skin. Chloe raised her glass and grinned. "To Dad, and to the future, where Kennedy & Vail becomes Kennedy Family Holdings." Applause, laughter, champagne flutes clinking. They had no idea how ironic that toast was. I turned slightly, my gaze landing on the briefcase leaning against the dessert table. Inside, wrapped in a manila folder, sat the board resolution signed just 24 hours earlier. The one that would end his consulting contract and block any nepotistic appointments. 6 months of quiet planning of legal strategy disguised as indifference. A woman's revenge doesn't need noise. It needs patience. Vivian glanced towards me, once her lips curling into a smirk. "Oh, sweetheart," she said loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Would you mind checking if the servers are bringing out the dessert plates? We're running behind." I met her eyes, calm, steady. "Of course," I said, and turned before she could enjoy the reaction she wanted. In the hallway, I leaned against the marble wall, the cool surface grounding me. For a moment, I let the music fade behind the closed doors and listened to my own heartbeat. He called me Staff. It should have hurt more than it did. But something in me had shifted. The part that used to crave recognition was gone. All that remained was clarity. He'd spent years treating love like currency, trading affection for obedience, attention for silence. Tonight, he'd finally spent his last ounce of dignity, and he didn't even know it yet. When I returned to the ballroom, the cake was being wheeled in a 3-tiered monument of sugar and ego, iced in the company's logo. "For the man who built an empire," the MC announced. I took a spot near the stage, half hidden behind a pillar. From there, I could see everything: my dad's satisfied grin, Vivian's hand on his shoulder, Chloe scrolling through her phone. The band shifted to a slow tune, something nostalgic. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC said, "before we invite Richard to say a few words, let's hear from the people who made this evening possible, our wonderful staff." A ripple of polite applause followed. My dad raised his glass toward the servers. "You've done a fine job," he said. Then his eyes flicked to me. For half a second, our gazes locked. I waited for him to recognize me, to soften. Instead, he smiled the same smile he used on investors. "Especially her," he said, gesturing vaguely. "She's been everywhere tonight, hasn't she?" Another wave of laughter. Something cold and electric spread through me. Not rage, not shame, but a calm so sharp it felt like glass. I nodded once the smallest bow of acknowledgement and turned away. My fingers brushed the folded papers inside my purse. 6 signatures, 3 legal seals. 1 microphone waiting for its moment. I didn't leave the party. I stayed until the last toast was made, until the lights dimmed just enough for everyone to relax, until the noise softened into that easy, drunk kind of cheer people mistake for joy. Then I walked toward the stage. The MC was preparing to hand the microphone back to Richard for his closing remarks. I caught his eye. "Excuse me," I said, smiling. "May I make a quick announcement on behalf of the board?" He hesitated, then nodded, thinking I was part of the event team. As I stepped up, the lights hit my face. The room hushed, curious. My dad's hand froze mid-air, still holding his glass. Vivian's smile stiffened. "Good evening," I began. My voice was calm, measured. "Before we cut the cake, the board of directors asked me to share a brief update. Kennedy and Vale would like to honor Richard Kennedy not only for his years of service, but for inspiring new policies to ensure fairness and integrity in our leadership transition." A polite murmur spread through the crowd. I caught the flicker of confusion in my dad's eyes. "This includes," I continued, "a unanimous decision to end all personal consulting contracts effective immediately and to implement an anti-nepotism clause in our bylaws." Silence. Utter delicious silence. I let the words settle, then smiled. "Congratulations, Dad. You've built something worth protecting." The next few seconds felt like eternity. His glass trembled slightly. Vivian's mouth opened, then closed. Chloe whispered, "What did she just say?" I didn't wait for applause. I placed the microphone gently back on the stand, nodded to the MC, and stepped down. Behind me, I heard the shuffle of confusion, the kind that precedes panic. I didn't look back. Outside, the night air bit through the satin of my dress. Snow was falling soft and soundless, blanketing the city in white. I stood under the awning, watching my breath rise in small clouds. Somewhere inside, they were still processing what had happened. I touched the pendant around my neck, the one that used to belong to my mom, and whispered, "It started." The world always mistakes silence for weakness. They never realize it's just the sound of strategy. Tomorrow, their faces would be pale. But tonight, I let them laugh. The next morning, the city looked too clean, too still, as if last night had been a dream that someone had swept away with the snow. I woke up before sunrise in my apartment on the east side of Chicago, the sound of the heater groaning through the vents. My phone was filled with unread messages from people who had been at the retirement party. I didn't open them. I made coffee, black and bitter, and sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker out one by one. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo wall. It had been the first thing I saw when I entered the ballroom. A timeline of his career printed on glossy paper and framed in gold. There were pictures from every decade. Richard shaking hands with politicians. Richard cutting ribbons. Richard smiling with Vivian in front of a company banner. Not one image of my mom, not one of me. I remembered how the photographer had come to our house when I was 12, lining us up in front of the Christmas tree. Mom had worn a green dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and Dad had joked about how he couldn't compete with her beauty. That photo used to sit on the piano. Last night I found it reprinted on the wall, cropped so that only his hand and the edge of his suit were visible. Her shoulder was gone. I stared at it too long enough for one of the event staff to notice and ask if I needed help. I smiled and said I was fine, but something in me cracked. That wall wasn't just decoration, it was a rewrite. I drove to the office that morning even though I didn't have to. The building that once held Kennedy Financial now had a new sign that read, Vail Partners. He had merged the name with his partners years ago, though everyone knew who still pulled the strings. I parked 2 blocks away and walked in with my visitor badge, pretending I needed to sign some final paperwork. The receptionist recognized me but didn't say anything. Maybe she remembered how I'd left quiet and unannounced after the board had restructured my role. The hallways smelled like polished wood and cologne. The same portraits hung there too, smaller versions of the ones from last night. At the end of the corridor in the corner near the elevators, I found what I came for, the storage cabinet labeled Archives. I pulled it open and sifted through the dusty frames stacked inside. Beneath a pile of outdated marketing posters, I found a photo wrapped in brown paper. My mom. Her smile was soft, patient, the way it always was when she had to wait for my dad to finish talking before she could speak. I slipped the photo into my coat pocket. When I got back to the lobby, a voice stopped me. It was Mr. Donovan, one of the board members. He had been there since the beginning, a man with careful eyes and an even more careful tone. He looked tired. Kara, he said, I didn't expect to see you here after last night. I told him I just wanted to grab a few personal files. He nodded, but I could tell he already knew why I was there. He hesitated before speaking again. You did what needed to be done. It was overdue. I thanked him and walked out before he could say more. The wind outside hit my face like a slap. I pulled my scarf tighter and started toward the river. The city was waking up, buses hissing along Michigan Avenue, people rushing with their coffee cups and phones, unaware that somewhere above them a quiet war of legacy was unfolding. At the bridge, I stopped and took the photo from my pocket. The edges were frayed. My mom, Margaret Kennedy, had been everything he wasn't. She believed in earning things honestly, in helping without needing credit. After she died, he called it a tragedy and used her name to build a foundation for publicity. He donated to universities-funded scholarships, smiled for cameras. What he never did was grieve. He replaced her before the ground above her grave had settled. When I was 17, he told me that emotions were distractions. I still hear his voice whenever I start to feel too much. You're too soft, Kara. You'll never survive in business if you keep taking things personally. He was wrong. Feeling deeply was what kept me alive. It was also what helped me see through him. That night at the party, when he looked past me as if I were invisible, I understood something I hadn't before. He didn't hate me. He needed me gone because I reminded him of what he did to her. My face, my voice, even my quietness. They were pieces of the woman he'd buried twice, once in the ground and once in memory. I walked along the river until my fingers went numb. The water moved slowly under the ice, a dull green mirror reflecting the steel skyline. I thought about what Vivian had said during her speech, about legacy and family. Legacy to them meant control. To me, it meant repair. Back home, I placed the photo of my mom on my desk beside a stack of legal folders. The sunlight fell across her face, catching the dust in the air. For the first time in years, I said her name out loud. It sounded strange, almost like a prayer. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Allison, my attorney. She had sent a short text, press coverage starting. They're asking questions. I typed back, let them. Just make sure the filings go public today. She replied with a single word already done. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. Somewhere, reporters were piecing together the story. The public would call it revenge. They always did when a woman refused to stay quiet. But to me, it wasn't revenge. It was a correction. The coffee had gone cold by the time I opened my eyes. I stood stretched and walked to the small bookshelf near the window. There was a framed letter tucked between 2 old law textbooks, a letter my mom had written the week before she died. I had read it too many times, but that morning the words hit differently. She had written about self-respect, about how sometimes you have to stand alone to see who still follows. She said that strength wasn't about fighting. It was about deciding when to stop explaining yourself. I ran my thumb over the last line. If he ever makes you feel small, remember who taught you how to stand tall. Outside, the sky turned the color of steel. A train rumbled in the distance. I picked up the phone again and scrolled through the messages I'd ignored. Earlier, one of them was from Chloe. It was short. You made a scene. Dad's furious. I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted it and turned off the screen. There was work to do. The documents on my desk outlined the next steps for the board transition. Donovan had already scheduled the official meeting for Monday. There were policies to finalize votes, to record statements, to prepare. My name would appear as interim chair. It still felt unreal. For years, I had imagined confronting my dad in 100 different ways, each one ending with me saying something clever or cutting that would make him understand. But now that I finally had the power, I didn't want to speak to him at all. Silence had said enough. I placed my mom's photo into a new frame and set it in the middle of the desk, where the morning light could reach it. She was smiling as if she knew. The edges of her picture caught a glint of gold from the lamp, and for a second it looked like she was surrounded by light. I whispered to her that I found her again, that I would make sure her name stayed on the things she built. Then I gathered the papers, slid them into a folder, and slipped the folder into my bag. I needed to go back to the office one more time quietly before the others arrived. There was something in the old conference room I wanted to see before they took his name off the door. The city was fully awake by the time I stepped outside. The cold had softened the air, carrying that clean scent that comes after snow. I buttoned my coat and started walking toward Michigan Avenue, the folder pressed against my side, the picture of my mom safe in my pocket. It was time to face what he'd built and to start undoing it, one truth at a time. 6 months earlier, I was standing in the lobby of the same building, pretending I was there to drop off a client file. The elevator doors opened, and I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls, hair pulled back, neutral suit face, calm enough to pass for indifferent. Inside, I was shaking. It had been 3 years since I left Kennedy Financial, or what was still called that at the time, and I told myself I was only there for a short meeting. I lied. I had come to see how much of my dad's empire I could still reach. The receptionist smiled politely. Her name tag said Elise. She didn't recognize me at first, and that helped. I signed the visitor log, took the elevator to the 18th floor, and walked straight into a glass conference room where Mr. Donovan and 2 other board members were waiting. They had called me weeks before, speaking in the careful language men use when they want to test loyalty without admitting fear. The numbers on the quarterly reports didn't add up. Consulting fees were draining cash from the company, and those fees all led to one account under my dad's name. Donovan closed the door once I sat down. He leaned forward, whispering, though no one else could hear us. "We think he is transferring funds to a private entity managed by his wife." He said it as if he hated the words. I looked at the spreadsheets. The transactions were obvious, too obvious for someone like my dad to overlook. That meant he didn't care if anyone saw. I asked Donovan why they hadn't stopped it. He shrugged. Loyalty, reputation, fear, take your pick. He said they needed someone who understood how Richard thought, someone who could find a clean way out before the company went under an audit. He looked at me as he said it. That was the moment I realized how power changes shape. It isn't always shouting or signatures on contracts. Sometimes it's a silent hand pushing you toward a choice you were already about to make. After the meeting, I went straight to the parking garage, sat in my car, and stared at the steering wheel until the air inside felt too heavy. I could expose him, but doing it publicly would destroy everything my mom once believed in. She had poured herself into this company-building trust with clients, teaching me that integrity was worth more than wealth. I couldn't drag her memory through the scandal, but I could fix what he broke. I contacted Allison 2 days later. She was an attorney I had met during a consulting job in Boston, someone who knew how to move quietly in corporate circles. When I explained the situation, she didn't ask if I was sure. She simply said, "All right, let's start with what you have." For weeks we met in cafes and borrowed offices, building a map of ownership. Through the trust my mom left me, I still held a portion of the company stock, small but significant when combined with shares held by 2 retired partners, who still respected her name. Allison arranged a private meeting with them. They were old men now, cautious, disillusioned by how things had changed. When I told them what I planned, one of them smiled faintly and said it sounded like something Margaret would have done. They signed the proxy agreements without hesitation. The rest of the summer passed in quiet preparation. While my dad announced a new expansion and attended charity galas with Vivian, I was working behind the scenes with Allison, drafting what we called the Resolution of Governance Integrity. It sounded dry, bureaucratic, safe. In truth, it was a document that would end his influence the moment the board approved it. I spent nights going through old files, tracing every consulting payment and bonus, documenting each transfer that violated company policy. Allison wanted to go to the authorities immediately. I told her no. This wasn't about revenge through scandal. It was about cleanliness. If I made it public, he would become the victim again. The misunderstood visionary. I needed the company to survive, not burn. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of research, I would forget the bitterness and feel only exhaustion. Then I would remember his words from years ago, telling me that emotions made me weak. I would picture my mom balancing the company's ledgers at the kitchen table while he was out entertaining investors. She never took credit for the success that was partly hers. When he left her, she said only that pride was a kind of poison. She wasn't wrong. By late autumn, everything was ready. Allison booked a small conference room at a neutral law office near Lincoln Park. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. I remember that morning clearly, the way the light hit the windows, the smell of coffee and snow mixed together. Donovan arrived first, carrying a folder of updated reports. The others followed. The tension in the room felt heavy enough to bend the air. I presented the findings in silence, slide by slide. No accusations, no dramatics, only numbers. When I finished, Donovan spoke. The board moved to adopt the new resolution, citing risk mitigation and compliance alignment. Simple words, yet they meant everything. Each man signed. Allison notarized the document. I watched the ink dry and thought of my mom's letter, the one about self-respect and standing alone. After they left, Allison stayed behind. She looked at me across the table and asked if I felt any satisfaction. I said not yet. She laughed softly. You will, she said, but it won't look like what you think. Outside the window, snow was starting to fall. Chicago in November always looked like a city trying to forgive itself. I pulled my coat tighter and walked toward the lake. The cold air made my lungs ache. I wondered if he sensed anything yet. If Vivian had noticed how the invitations to board dinners had stopped arriving, probably not. People like my dad believe their reflection until it cracks. That night, I drove past the company headquarters again. The lights on the upper floors were still on. I could see his office from the street, the same one where he used to sit me on the edge of his desk when I was a child, showing me balance sheets as if they were fairy tales. He taught me to read numbers before I could read novels. Now those same numbers would undo him. I parked across the street and watched until the light in his office went dark. Then I whispered to the empty car that this was not vengeance. It was inheritance, the honest kind. I owed him nothing, but I owed my mom the truth. The next day, I mailed the certified copies of the resolution to the registered address of the company to each board member, and one sealed envelope to Richard himself. Inside it, I placed a single page. It said, "Only for integrity's sake," signed K. For the next several weeks, I heard nothing. He was quiet, which was unusual for him. Normally, he would call, demand explanations, threaten to cut off access. Instead, there was silence. Then one morning, Allison forwarded me an internal memo announcing his retirement celebration scheduled for December. I read the date twice. She sent another message beneath it. He's planning a farewell gala. You might want to be there. I didn't reply right away. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee growing cold again, and stared at the calendar. The irony wasn't lost on me. The party was the same week my mom's scholarship fund was supposed to launch. Later that night, I booked a dress alteration appointment and sent Allison a short text. Let him have his stage, I'll bring the microphone. The months of preparation had turned into a habit, each task a layer of calm. By the time winter arrived, I no longer felt anger, only purpose. Revenge wasn't fired anymore. It was ice clean and quiet, waiting for the right moment to crack. On the morning of the party, I stood before the mirror, fastening the pendant. My mom had left me the one shaped like a small silver key. It belonged to her first desk at the company. When she died, I found it in a box labeled Future. I didn't know what she meant until now. The car arrived outside. I took one last look around my apartment, checked the envelope in my purse, and locked the door behind me. The city lights blurred against the windshield as the driver headed toward the hotel on Michigan Avenue. I could see my reflection in the glass, calm, steady, unreadable. Somewhere inside that ballroom, my dad was already rehearsing his speech. I imagined him standing beneath the chandeliers, smiling for cameras, believing he had rewritten history one last time. He had no idea the ink was already dry. By the time the car turned onto the hotel driveway, snow had started again, fine and silent, the kind that looks harmless until it settles everywhere. I watched it gather on the steps and thought of my mom's words about standing tall. Then I exhaled slowly and stepped out into the cold. The folder pressed against my side, the weight of everything I'd prepared resting quietly in my hands. The ballroom of the Lakeshore Grand smelled of lilies and expensive champagne. Waiters moved like clockwork through the crowd, carrying trays of tiny canapes that no one really ate. I stood near the back entrance holding my clutch in both hands, watching my dad laugh with the people who used to report to me. The chandeliers reflected in the polished marble floor, throwing light across his face and making him look younger than he was. Vivian stood beside him in a navy gown, her hand resting lightly on his arm. A man from the event team passed by and nodded at me as if I were one of them. I didn't correct him. It was easier to blend in. My dress was simple black silk, the kind that drew no attention. But Chloe still managed to find something wrong with it. She drifted toward me, holding a glass of rosé, the smile already forming before she spoke. "You must have missed the dress code," she said, tilting her head. "We were asked to wear silver or gold family colors, you know." I looked at her bracelet glittering under the lights. She had no idea that the metal clasp on her wrist cost less than the pen in my bag, the one engraved with my dad's name. I smiled and told her that black went with everything. She laughed, the kind of laugh that waited for an audience, then turned back toward her mom. The speeches had started. The MC praised my dad's decades of leadership, his generosity, and his contributions to the Chicago business community. Every sentence made the room warmer with self-congratulation. I watched from a distance as the camera crew filmed, making sure to capture every angle of him smiling. The irony was almost perfect. When the applause quieted, Vivian took the microphone. Her voice had that soft tremor she used for effect. "Tonight is not just about Richard," she said. "It is about legacy, about the family that will carry his vision forward." There was a murmur of approval. She continued, saying how proud she was that Chloe had agreed to take a leadership role in the new foundation. My hands tightened around my clutch. So this was how they planned to keep the money moving, rebranding his consulting contract as a charitable advisory position. Vivian gestured toward a slide on the screen behind her. A logo appeared elegant and modern, reading the Vivian Kennedy Scholarship Fund. The audience clapped. I stared at the name and felt the air leave my lungs for a moment. My mom's scholarship, the one she started years ago to help single moms return to school, had been renamed. Not continued, erased. I could hear the waiter behind me whisper to another that the boss's wife looked stunning tonight. I turned slightly and caught his reflection in a silver tray. The whole room shimmered like a movie set. My dad stood, taking the microphone, his voice full of warmth. He thanked everyone, mentioned teamwork, tradition, and family. He said the company would continue to thrive under new management. He did not mention me. For a while, I simply listened. The noise became a blur, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation. I thought about my mom's letter again, about strength being the moment you stop explaining yourself. I thought about how easily people could rewrite history if no one kept the records. I was tired of being quiet. The servers began bringing out dinner plates. I took a seat near the edge of the room, close enough to see, but far enough to be forgotten. A group of junior executives joined my table, not realizing who I was. They talked about bonuses and travel plans. One of them mentioned that Chloe would likely get the operations title after the holidays. I nodded, pretending interest. Vivian walked past our table, pausing when she noticed me. Her perfume followed, the same cloying floral scent she had worn to my mom's funeral. She smiled. "Kara, I'm so glad you could come," she said lightly, as if the earlier slight about my dress hadn't happened. "You've always supported Richard's work, haven't you?" I answered yes, my voice even. She leaned closer and lowered her tone. "Would you mind checking with the staff about dessert timing, dear? I think they're running a bit late." The words were coated in sugar, but the meaning was the same. "Stay in your place." I stood, nodded politely, and walked toward the kitchen door. Inside, the catering team was plating the final course. The air smelled of chocolate and coffee. A young server looked up and smiled nervously, asking if everything was all right. I told him it was perfect. I waited a moment, letting my heart beat slow, then slipped back into the hallway. From there, I could see the main floor through a side mirror. My dad had his arm around Vivian now. They looked like a portrait, perfect and hollow. The guests laughed at something he said. Chloe lifted her phone to record him. I noticed the light catching the edge of her glass, turning the wine red like a warning. I found myself near the coat room. On the small counter sat the box of backup name cards for guests. I flipped through them until I found mine, Kara Kennedy. The letters were neat, printed in gold. There was a thin line of ink across it where someone had drawn through the word family and written staff underneath. I stared at it until the noise from the ballroom grew distant. In that moment, everything became simple. There was no anger, only clarity. Every humiliation, every dismissal, every erased name led here. The documents in my purse felt heavier than before. I touched the envelope inside, making sure it was still there, the one containing the signed resolution. I returned to the table before anyone noticed I was gone. Vivian glanced my way, satisfied, assuming I had done as asked. I sat down, lifted my water glass, and watched as my dad began his final speech of the night. His voice was steady, rehearsed, the same cadence he used during investor calls. He spoke about gratitude and the future. He thanked the board for their loyalty. He raised his glass to family. The crowd rose in applause. Cameras flashed. He smiled that perfect smile again. I joined in the clapping, soft and even, just enough to blend with the noise. When the applause died down and the band began to play, people started drifting toward the bar. Vivian leaned close to him, whispering something that made him laugh. Chloe checked her reflection in her phone camera. The servers moved between tables, clearing plates. I finished my water and placed the glass neatly on the linen. The condensation left a faint circle. I traced it with my fingertip, thinking about my mom's habit of doing the same when she was lost in thought. The microphone was still on the podium, unattended, its red light blinking quietly. A waiter passed by carrying a tray of empty glasses and smiled at me again, unaware that the quiet woman in the black dress was not staff, not family, but something in between. I stood slowly gathering my clutch. My dad's laughter floated through the room again, loud and certain. I looked toward the stage where the microphone waited, the lights glinting off its silver frame. It wasn't time yet, not quite. I walked toward the far end of the hall where the service corridor opened, into the hotel lobby. The air was cooler there, the music muffled. I stood for a moment watching the revolving doors spin, people coming and going, the night pressing close against the glass. Inside my purse, the papers rustled softly as I shifted my hand. They felt warm from being held too long. Outside, snow was falling again, slow and steady. I took a breath and whispered under it that patience was part of the plan. I would let them finish their celebration. Then I would end it on my own terms. The elevator doors opened to the 18th floor with a soft chime that disappeared under the hum of the building. I stepped out into the quiet hallway lined with frosted glass walls and framed awards. The lights were dimmed for the weekend, but the security system still glowed faintly on the corner monitors. I had been here so many times that my body moved on instinct, the rhythm of my heels matching the echo of memory. The conference room door was unlocked. I slipped inside and closed it behind me. The air smelled of paper and stale coffee. The long mahogany table stretched under the soft glow of recessed lights. This was where everything had begun, where my mom had spent endless nights preparing reports while my dad rehearsed speeches in the next room. I ran my hand along the polished surface, the same table where the first contracts of Kennedy Financial had been signed 30 years ago. From my bag, I took the manila folder wrapped in a leather case. Inside was the resolution signed and sealed. The signatures of the board members curved neatly across the bottom of the page, each one a quiet rebellion. The document was simple in language, but heavy in meaning. It ended all consulting contracts effective immediately and prohibited any family member from holding paid positions within the firm. It also reinstated the original scholarship fund under my mom's name. I placed the folder on the table and stood for a moment, letting the silence settle around it. Outside the window, the lights of downtown Chicago spread like a field of glass. The river below was dark and still, the kind of stillness that comes before change. My phone vibrated once. It was a message from Allison. Everything filed and time-stamped, she wrote. Copies delivered to compliance and the registrar. Her efficiency always amazed me. I typed back a short thank you and put the phone away. On the wall across the room hung the old company portrait. My dad stood in the center, Vivian beside him, Chloe on his right. The executives flanked them, smiling. I looked at the bottom row of smaller faces, the employees who had been there from the start. My mom had taken the photo herself, refusing to stand in it because she said it belonged to them. I stared at the frame until my reflection blurred into the glass. The door opened behind me. Mr. Donovan stepped inside, his gray coat still dusted with snow. He closed the door softly, giving me a look that was half curiosity, half concern. I heard from Allison that you were coming in tonight, he said quietly. I nodded, not surprised. He walked closer, hands clasped behind his back. He looked at the folder on the table. It is done then, I said yes. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. You know this will cause waves. I told him waves were necessary when the water had been still for too long. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both respect and regret. You have her strength, he said. I didn't need to ask who he meant. We stood there for a while, listening to the faint hum of the city. He eventually nodded toward the folder. You should keep a copy in your own files, just in case. I reached into my bag and took out the duplicate, sliding it into a smaller envelope marked with my initials. He picked up the main folder and tucked it under his arm. I will deliver this to the board's office first thing in the morning. Before leaving, he paused by the door. He asked if I was certain about attending the party tomorrow night. I said yes. He hesitated again, then said that some men only learn humility when it's handed to them in public. I didn't respond. After he left, the silence returned thicker than before. I turned off the lights and stood in the dark room watching the skyline through the window. The reflection of the city floated in the glass like a second world, one where everything was reversed. I thought of my dad in his penthouse across the river, maybe pouring another drink, unaware that the foundation beneath him had already shifted. I locked the door and took the elevator to the lobby. The night guard nodded at me as I passed, not asking questions. Outside, the wind swept along the sidewalks, lifting small drifts of snow. I walked 2 blocks to my car, the folder pressed against my side, the paper warm from my hands. Driving home, I passed through the streets where I had once followed him as a child, watching him step out of black cars, shaking hands, always looking larger than life. The same man who once told me that kindness was weakness and family was just an investment. I wondered if he would recognize me at all tomorrow night when I stood on that stage. At a red light, I looked down at the envelope on the passenger seat. My name printed neatly on the corner looked strange beside the company seal. For years, I had tried to separate myself from it. Now I carried the power to rewrite it. When I reached my apartment, I left the folder on the counter and filled a glass of water. The city lights reflected against the window, flickering like distant fires. I thought of my mom again. Her voice soft but steady, telling me that revenge was not the goal, only balance. She used to say that the truth always finds its own timing. I took the picture of her from my desk and set it beside the folder. Her eyes seemed to follow me around the room. I told her that the papers were ready, that her scholarship would carry her name again, that the people who erased her would soon have to face what they had done. The clock on the wall read close to midnight. I should have been tired, but the thought of what was coming kept me awake. I sat on the edge of the couch and imagined the look on my dad's face when he realized the company no longer belonged to him. It wasn't satisfaction, I felt only calm. A deep, settled calm that came from knowing the story was about to correct itself. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, rattling it softly. Somewhere in the city, preparations for the retirement gala were underway. Flowers, music, cameras, speeches. All the symbols of celebration are built on a hollow foundation. I turned off the lights and stood at the window until the last taxi disappeared from the street below. Then I whispered to the darkness that tomorrow everything would end quietly, the way it should. I placed the envelope into my purse, checked the clasp, and left it there on the counter. The air felt cold enough to keep me alert. When I finally lay down, I thought of my dad's voice calling my name when I was a child, softer then, before ambition had taken everything. I wondered if he remembered those moments or if they had been buried under layers of pride. The question lingered until sleep came light and restless, filled with the sound of distant applause that would soon fade into silence. The applause inside the Lakeshore Grand swelled like a wave when the MC announced my dad's name. Richard Kennedy walked onto the stage with that same practiced confidence that had once filled boardrooms and interviews. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his silver cufflinks glinting under the lights. He lifted the microphone and smiled as if the whole world belonged to him. I stood near the back of the room, my hand resting lightly on the strap of my purse. The envelope inside pressed against my palm. Around me, people leaned in, smiling, nodding, clapping again when he thanked them for their loyalty and friendship. I could almost hear his familiar rhythm, the same tone he used in every speech, slow and deliberate, pausing before each line to let people agree. He spoke about building something from nothing, about sacrifice, about legacy. His voice softened when he mentioned family. I saw Vivian glance up at him, eyes shining. Chloe dabbed at the corner of her eyes with a napkin, performing emotion for the crowd. I felt nothing. Every word sounded like a sale, a pitch for a story he had rewritten too many times. The MC moved forward again, thanking him for his leadership and announcing a toast to new beginnings. Glasses lifted 1,000 points of light, catching the chandeliers. My dad raised his own glass, grinning wide. "Before we close," he said, "I would like to thank our wonderful staff for making this night possible." He turned, gesturing vaguely in my direction, especially her. "She has been everywhere tonight, making sure everything runs smoothly." The room laughed, light and pleasant. I stood very still. He saw me. I knew he saw me, he just refused to admit it. My fingers closed around the envelope. Allison's words from months ago echoed in my mind, that justice sometimes needs a stage. I waited until the laughter faded and the music began again. People started drifting toward the dessert tables. The noise thinned, replaced by the shuffle of waiters and the clink of dishes. I stepped forward slowly, weaving between groups of people, each step steady. The MC was turning off the microphone when I reached him. I smiled politely and asked if I could make a short announcement on behalf of the board. He looked unsure but handed it to me anyway. The weight of it in my hand felt heavier than I expected. I turned toward the room. The crowd continued talking until my voice carried through the speakers. "Good evening." The sound of it stopped them. My dad's glass froze halfway to his lips. Vivian's smile faltered. I continued, speaking calm and even. "Before we move to dessert, the board of directors has asked me to share a brief update regarding company policy." The silence spread slowly, a ripple moving across the tables. I could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward me. I kept my tone professional. Earlier this quarter, the board reviewed our consulting and transition agreements. As part of a new governance initiative, we voted to conclude all personal consulting contracts effective immediately. Someone near the front gasped softly. My dad lowered his glass. I could see the confusion in his eyes. I continued before anyone could interrupt. In addition, an updated policy regarding conflict of interest and nepotism has been unanimously approved. All future appointments and paid advisory roles will require independent review. The words landed cleanly, without anger, only precision. It was the language of compliance, the kind of language my dad had always used to protect himself. Now it was being used against him. I paused just long enough for the weight of it to settle. The air in the room felt heavy. Then I looked toward the front row. I want to personally thank Richard Kennedy for his decades of leadership. His example reminds us that legacy must be built on fairness, not favoritism. My dad stood. His expression was careful, polite, but his jaw tightened. He said my name finally, quiet but sharp. "Kara, that's enough." I met his eyes. "I'm almost finished." He took a step forward, but Vivian's hand caught his arm. She whispered something that made him stop. The guests sat frozen, unsure whether to clap or leave. I lifted the envelope and opened it, pulling out a single page. The board's resolution has been filed and certified. Copies are available through compliance. Effective tomorrow morning, the new structure will begin. I folded the paper and placed it back in the envelope. There was a faint murmur from the crowd. Then I smiled. "Thank you for your time. Please enjoy the evening." I placed the microphone back on the stand and turned to walk off stage. The sound of my heels on the polished floor filled the silence until the band began playing again, too quickly, too loud. I could feel the eyes following me as I crossed the room. Vivian whispered to one of the coordinators. Chloe stared down at her phone, pretending to scroll. My dad didn't move. His reflection in the mirror behind the stage looked smaller somehow, the edges of his confidence beginning to crack. I reached the far side of the ballroom and stopped near the tall windows. Outside, the city shimmered under thin layers of snow. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from release. The noise behind me was distant now, like a storm moving away. Mr. Donovan appeared beside me, unnoticed by most. He leaned close enough for me to hear. "You did it," he said. I nodded without turning. "It's only the first part," I told him. He nodded and walked away quietly. Across the room, Vivian was speaking rapidly to a group of guests. Her smile stretched too wide. My dad still stood near the stage, surrounded by people who didn't know what to say. He glanced toward me once. Our eyes met through the crowd. Neither of us looked away. I lifted my glass of water and held it in a small salute. He didn't return it. He set his drink down on the table instead, staring at it as if it had betrayed him. The band played another song, the melody light and cheerful. Guests began to whisper again, laughter returning in uneasy bursts. I walked toward the exit, pausing at the doorway. Behind me, I heard the MC trying to regain the room, thanking everyone for coming, inviting them to enjoy the dessert buffet. The sound of forced celebration filled the space where authority had once lived. I stepped into the hallway where the music dimmed to a distant hum. My reflection followed me in the glass doors leading to the lobby. For the first time in years, I looked at myself and didn't see a shadow of him. I saw a woman standing upright, quiet but unshaken. Outside, the night was cold. The wind carried the faint scent of pine from the wreaths hung along Michigan Avenue. Cars waited in a line at the valet headlights scattering across the pavement. I walked to the edge of the steps and looked back through the glass doors. He was still inside, frozen between pride and disbelief. I tightened my coat and whispered into the wind that I had only spoken the truth. Then I stepped into the waiting car, closing the door softly behind me. As the driver pulled away, I watched the lights of the hotel fade into the distance. The city moved past in streaks of silver and gold. The envelope rested on my lap, lighter now that it had served its purpose. I leaned my head against the seat and closed my eyes. The sound of the tires against the wet street was steady, almost like a heartbeat. Tomorrow, the papers would reach the company's headquarters, and the new policy would take effect. Tonight was only the beginning. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the city was wrapped in a pale gray light. Snow covered the roofs across the street, soft and untouched. I sat up slowly and for a moment forgot what day it was. Then the memory of last night returned in full color. The sound of my own voice through the microphone, the silence that followed, the way my dad's face had gone still. I poured a glass of water and stood by the window watching the first few cars move along the avenue below. The calm in the air felt too clean, like the pause before a storm. The phone on my kitchen counter buzzed with messages. Allison's name appeared at the top. She had already seen the news. Local Business Daily had posted a short article just after midnight. Kennedy and Vale implements new anti-nepotism policy. Leadership transition under review. I read it twice. The photograph beneath the headline showed the ballroom filled with people mid-applause, unaware that the speech had changed everything. I set the phone down and made coffee, letting the scent fill the room. By 8 o'clock, the television networks picked up the story. Reporters outside the Lakeshore Grand interviewed guests who could only describe the scene as shocking. One woman said it was like watching a play where the ending rewrote itself. Another said she admired the courage it took to speak in front of so many people. The camera cut to the hotel entrance as staff carried out leftover decorations. The image of the champagne tower stood half empty, glittering with the light of flashbulbs. My dad had not made a statement. The news anchor said his representatives were unavailable for comment. I knew he was too proud to speak until he had a version of the story that made him the victim. He had done that all his life. I sipped the coffee and waited for the first call that mattered. It came just before 9. Mr. Donovan's voice sounded tired but satisfied. The transition papers were filed. The board had confirmed the change in consulting contracts and approved the scholarship rededication. The fund would once again carry my mom's name. He said the press might contact me later for a comment, but I told him there was nothing to add. Facts spoke louder than explanations. He agreed and hung up. Outside, a steady snowfall began again. I pulled on a coat and walked to the park across from my building. The air smelled clean, the kind of cold that clears the lungs. I passed a group of joggers, their breath fogging the air. At the far end of this path stood a bronze statue of a woman holding an open book, part of a memorial for local educators. I brushed the snow off the plaque and read the inscription about knowledge, outlasting ambition. It made me think of my mom again, and the way she used to sit at the kitchen table correcting my essays with a red pen, her coffee always growing cold beside her hand. By noon, my phone was full again. Messages from old co-workers, distant relatives, strangers. Some were congratulations, others warnings. I ignored them all until I saw one from Chloe. It was only a line of text. "You embarrassed him in front of everyone." I stared at it for a while before deleting it. Vivian sent an email later that afternoon, written in her formal tone. She asked how I could do something so cruel to a man who had given me everything. I closed it without replying. The apartment felt quiet, too quiet. I turned on the radio to fill the space and began sorting through the documents Allison had sent overnight. There were transfer receipts, policy amendments, and signatures. Each page was a piece of the new foundation. Among them was a smaller envelope I hadn't noticed before. Inside was a printed photo from the party. It showed me at the microphone head, slightly tilted, eyes calm. Behind me, the room blurred into a sea of faces. On the back, Allison had written one sentence. Their faces went pale. I set the photo against the lamp and stared at it for a long time. It didn't look like victory. It looked like the truth was finally catching up. That evening, I decided to go for a walk. The snow had stopped and the streets were slick with light. Passing a newsstand, I saw my dad's picture on the front of a business magazine, taken months ago. The headline read, "A Legacy Questioned." I kept walking until I reached the bridge over the Chicago River. The water below moved slowly and heavy, carrying thin sheets of ice. I leaned on the railing and watched them drift apart. Somewhere across town, my dad was likely in his office trying to gather support. He would be furious, but not because of the loss. Fury for him always came from humiliation, from being seen as less than the myth he built. He would call meetings, draft letters, deny everything. It would take time before he realized none of it could undo the signatures, already filed. I stayed on the bridge until the wind cut through my gloves. As I turned back toward home, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Allison with a link. A live recording from last night had started spreading online. Someone from the catering staff had filmed the speech. The title read, "Daughter Ends Father's Dynasty," with one announcement. I watched the first few seconds, the camera shaky, the sound echoing. My voice came through, steady and clear. "Before we moved to dessert." I stopped the video and turned off the screen. It didn't matter how many people watched it. The moment had already happened. At home, I poured another cup of coffee and sat by the window. The lights from the buildings shimmered on the river. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the pull of unfinished business. The phone rang again, a new number. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, the message icon appeared. It was my dad. His voice was rougher than I remembered. He said we needed to talk, that there had been misunderstandings, that family should handle things privately. He paused before adding that he was willing to forgive me. I listened to the message twice, then deleted it. Forgiveness had always been his way of keeping control. I wanted peace, not pardon. The clock read close to midnight when I finally turned off the lights. Outside, the city hummed softly. Somewhere below, a taxi horn echoed against the snow. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the photograph again. The image of me on stage seemed to stare back, a stranger and a reflection at the same time. I placed the photo inside the drawer and whispered a quiet promise to my mom that it was almost done. The hardest part was over, but the silence that followed carried its own weight. Tomorrow, I would decide what to do with the name on the scholarship, the final step in turning everything he had tried to erase into something that could never be forgotten. The morning after the news broke, the air in Chicago felt sharper than usual. I woke before sunrise to the sound of sirens fading down the avenue, and for a moment I thought it was still snowing. When I opened the blinds, the sky was clear-washed pale blue by the cold. The headlines had multiplied overnight. Every paper in the city carried a version of the same story. The retired founder of Kennedy and Vail had been removed from his consulting position following a surprise announcement by his daughter during his farewell gala. I dressed quietly and walked to the corner cafe where the barista already knew my order. He slid the cup across the counter without comment. I sat by the window where sunlight spilled across the table. Two men at the next table were reading the same article, their voices low. One of them said it was poetic justice. The other called it family suicide. I stirred my coffee slowly and smiled to myself. Justice had a way of looking like ruin to those who benefited from unfairness. By mid-morning, Allison called. She said the company's public relations department had released a short statement confirming the policy change. She also said that messages of support were flooding the foundation's email. Women from across the state were asking how to apply for the scholarship. I asked her to forward them all to the new office once it was ready. She laughed and said she would start interviewing staff next week. Her voice softened when she asked how I felt. I told her to be calm, and she said that was the right answer. Later that day, I walked along Michigan Avenue where the sidewalks were still edged with slush. The storefronts glittered with leftover holiday decorations. People brushed past faces hidden in scarves, moving with the urgency of the season. I passed a bookstore and saw a familiar book in the window, a financial memoir my dad had written years ago about leadership and vision. The cover showed him standing in front of the skyline. I looked at it for a long moment before walking on. At the corner of State Street, I stopped to buy a newspaper from an older vendor who had been there since I was in college. He looked up and recognized me from the photo. His smile was small but sincere. "Good for you," he said. "It takes courage to stand up to men like that." I thanked him and tucked the paper under my arm. When I reached the bridge, I paused halfway across. The wind off the water was sharp enough to sting. The river had started to thaw in patches, thin ice breaking apart with soft cracking sounds. I leaned against the railing and watched the current pull the fragments away. It reminded me of how easily things could drift once they were set free. That afternoon, I returned to my apartment and began clearing the files that had filled my desk for months. I placed the original copies of the resolution into a safe box and labeled it simply Records. The folder that had once held the evidence against my dad, I fed through the shredder, watching each page disappear into strips. Some victories required letting go of proof. The phone rang again just before evening. It was Mr. Donovan. He said the board had met to finalize the leadership transition and that everything was proceeding smoothly. He also mentioned that several employees had expressed relief after hearing about the new policies. It seemed the change had given them a sense of protection they had not felt in years. I thanked him and asked that the first internal memo about the scholarship be distributed company-wide. He promised to handle it personally. After dinner, I took the elevator to the roof of the building. The city stretched out below, lights flickering like small fires. I stood near the railing with my hands tucked in my coat pockets. Somewhere beyond the skyline, my dad was sitting in his penthouse, perhaps still surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear. I wondered if he was angry or simply tired. I hoped for the latter. Anger kept him alive in the wrong way. I stayed on the roof until the cold reached through my gloves. When I went back inside, there was a small envelope slipped under my door. My name was written in his handwriting. I hesitated before picking it up. The paper felt heavy, as if carrying more than words. Inside was a single sheet. It said that he wished to meet, that he wanted to explain that we were still family. At the bottom was his signature, bold and certain, as always. I read it twice and folded it back into the envelope. Then I set it on the counter without deciding what to do. The next morning, I took the train to the west side where the new foundation office was being prepared. The building was modest, an old brick structure converted into shared workspaces. Inside, painters were finishing the walls, while movers assembled furniture. A young woman greeted me at the door and said she was there to apply for the administrative assistant position. Her name was Lila. She looked nervous until she realized who I was. She said she had heard about the scholarship and wanted to work for something. That mattered. Her sincerity caught me off guard. I told her to come back Monday when Allison would be there to interview. She thanked me twice before leaving. Standing in that empty office, I imagined what it would look like in a few weeks. Desks, computers, letters arriving from students. The noise of people building something instead of tearing it apart. It felt like air returning after a long silence. I walked to the large window that faced the street and looked out at the passing cars. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel pride without guilt. When I returned home, the city was quiet again. Snow had begun to fall in soft flakes, covering the pavement in a thin white layer. I turned on the lamp beside my desk and unfolded my mom's photograph. Her smile was calm, almost knowing. I told her out loud that it was nearly over, that the name she gave to her work would stay in the world long after the noise faded. The envelope from my dad still sat on the counter. I looked at it one more time and then slipped it into the drawer with the photograph. Some conversations did not need to happen. The truth had already been spoken, and words would only turn it back into argument. Outside, the snow kept falling steady and soundless. I opened the window slightly and let the cold air drift in. It smelled like iron and clean stone. The city lights blurred into soft halos. I closed my eyes and breathed until the air stopped feeling cold. Tomorrow would bring questions, interviews, maybe more noise, but tonight belonged to stillness. The work was done, the lines drawn. Somewhere beneath the snow, the first traces of thaw were waiting, and I was ready for whatever would rise when the ice finally melted. The city woke slowly that Monday, gray light spreading across the lake and into the streets. I stood at the kitchen counter waiting for the coffee to finish brewing, the sound of the machine soft and steady. The newspaper lay folded beside my phone. I had stopped reading the headlines but still bought it every morning out of habit. The top story was about the company's formal handover, accompanied by a photograph of the new board members standing outside the building. My dad's name was printed once in small letters near the end, followed by the phrase, "Retired Executive Consultant." I read it twice and smiled. When I stepped outside, the cold air bit my face. The sidewalks were clear again. The weekend snow melted into narrow streams along the curbs. On the way to the foundation office, I passed the cafe where I used to meet Allison. The same barista was there humming softly as he wiped the counter. He saw me and lifted a hand in greeting. I waved back and kept walking. The city was beginning to feel familiar again, not as a place that held my past, but as one that could hold what came next. The office smelled of new paint and coffee. Lila was already there, sorting envelopes at the front desk. She looked up quickly when I entered, smiling with that eager energy of someone starting something new. Allison had left a note on my desk, along with a stack of letters from women applying for the scholarship. I sat down and began to read. Each story carried its own rhythm, full of small struggles and quiet hopes. One was from a single mom in Milwaukee studying nursing at night after work. Another from a woman in her 40s returning to college after raising her children. Their words were steady and unpolished, but every line reminded me why this mattered. Around noon, Allison arrived with coffee and her usual calm. She said the press attention had started to settle, that most of the coverage now focused on the scholarship rather than the scandal. She handed me an envelope with the new bank documents for the fund. The account was active, the first deposits already cleared. We spent the afternoon reviewing applications, deciding to award 3 initial grants before the end of spring. It felt simple and solid the way real work should. In the late afternoon, the phone on my desk rang. It was a number I did not recognize. When I answered, a woman introduced herself as a reporter from a national business magazine. She asked for a comment about the leadership transition, saying the public was curious about how it had affected my relationship with my dad. I told her the story was no longer about him. It was about the people the company and foundation would now serve. She thanked me for my time and promised to quote me accurately. When I hung up, Allison was watching. She smiled and said that was the best answer anyone could give. As evening approached, the office grew quiet. Leela locked the front door and waved goodnight, her scarf trailing behind her as she left. Allison gathered her papers and said she would email me in the morning. I stayed behind, turning off lights one by one until only the lamp on my desk remained. The city outside the window glowed with soft gold. Cars moved like lines of light across the bridge. I reached into the drawer and took out the envelope my dad had sent. I opened it again, reading the same words he had written in that steady, practiced handwriting. He wanted to meet to explain to forgive. The words were heavy with habit, not love. I placed the letter back into the drawer and closed it gently. The silence in the office reminded me of the nights when my mom used to work, late her typewriter clicking through the dark while I did homework beside her. She would stop sometimes to ask if I was tired, and when I said no, she would smile and say that meant I was built for long stories. I whispered that she had been right. When I finally left the building, the air outside carried the scent of wet stone and streetlights. The river below was beginning to move faster with the change in temperature. I walked along the path until I reached the small bridge near Wacker Drive, where the wind always picked up in bursts. The lights from the office buildings shimmered on the water. I leaned on the railing, the cold metal pressing into my gloves. For the first time in years, I felt the pull of peace instead of anger. Revenge had burned away, leaving only clarity. On the other side of the river, a photographer was taking pictures of the skyline. He adjusted his lens, looked up, and waved at me. I waved back. The moment was quiet but complete, like the last line of a story that did not need a sequel. When I returned home, the answering machine blinked once. The message was from Donovan. He said the board had decided to rename one of the company's community awards in honor of my mom. He wanted my permission before finalizing it. I listened to the message twice before deleting it. Then I called him back and said yes. I poured a glass of wine and sat near the window where the lights of the city reached into the room. I thought about how far the story had come from that first night at the party, from the laughter and the humiliation that had started everything. Sometimes silence was not the absence of sound, but the space left for something better to grow. I finished the wine and placed the glass in the sink. The reflection of the city in the window looked softer now, almost kind. I turned off the lights and stood there until the room settled into silence. Tomorrow, the foundation will announce the first 3 scholarship recipients. I pictured their faces, the relief, the excitement, the small but certain shift their lives would take. Outside, a single snowflake landed against the glass, then melted and disappeared. The streetlights flickered once and the city exhaled. I took a deep breath with it and whispered into the dark that I was ready for whatever came next. The morning sunlight spilled through the glass doors of the foundation's new office, catching the gold letters on the sign that read the Margaret Kennedy Scholarship Fund. The paint smell had finally faded, replaced by the faint scent of paper and coffee. I stood in the doorway holding a box of files, listening to the low hum of the city beyond the windows. Inside the desks were filled now, phones ringing softly, keyboards clicking. It was no longer just a space, it was alive. Lila looked up from her computer when she saw me and waved. "There's someone here to see you," she said. A young woman stood near the reception desk, holding a folder close to her chest. She wore a gray coat, the kind with too many winters on it, and her shoes were damp from the melting snow. She smiled nervously as I approached. Her name was Danielle. She had been awarded one of the first scholarships, a nursing student from Evanston raising a 5-year-old son while working nights at a clinic. She wanted to thank me in person before her semester began. We sat in the small meeting room by the window while she told me her plans. She spoke quickly, afraid of taking too much time. She said she had watched the video from the gala and that it had given her courage to apply even though she didn't think she deserved help. I told her she did. When she left, she hugged me lightly and said she hoped to make my mom proud. Her words caught me off guard. After she was gone, I stayed by the window for a long time, watching the traffic move below, thinking about how quietly change begins. Allison arrived later with coffee and the week's reports. The foundation had already received dozens of new applications, and more donations were coming in. Some from women who had never met my mom but said her story reminded them of their own. Allison handed me an envelope with the latest statements and smiled. "We are ahead of schedule," she said. For once in my life, those words felt like peace instead of pressure. By noon, a light rain began to fall. I stepped outside onto the small balcony that overlooked the river. The water moved steadily, dark and calm. Across the street, the mirrored windows of Kennedy and Vale caught the reflection of the sky. I wondered if my dad was inside or if he had finally let it go. I hoped he had found quiet even if it was not forgiveness. Back inside, Lila was unpacking new stationery. She asked if I wanted to keep the old company seal that had arrived in one of the boxes from storage. I looked at it for a moment, the engraved initials faded from years of use. Then I told her to put it away in the back cabinet, where it could rest as part of what once was. Some things did not need to be displayed to be remembered. As the afternoon stretched on, the office filled with the small sounds of work, printers' voices, the soft buzz of light. I opened my notebook and began writing a short statement for the website, something to describe what the scholarship stood for. The words came easily. It was about second chances, about dignity, about women who refused to disappear quietly. It was about the belief that justice is not loud but lasting. When I finished, I read it aloud once, then closed the notebook. The rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, lighting up the water below. I walked to the window and placed my hand against the glass. My reflection overlapped with the city behind it. The buildings, the bridge, the movement of life continuing. I thought about my mom's words written all those years ago. If he ever makes you feel small, remember who taught you how to stand tall. I whispered that I remembered. The day ended the way most good days do, quietly and without ceremony. Allison left first, promising to email me final figures in the morning. Lila turned off the front lights and locked the door. I stayed a little longer, walking through the office once more, touching the back of each chair, checking the frames on the wall. On the center wall hung the photo of my mom, smiling beside the original scholarship check. The frame caught the last light of day and made it look as if she were standing in the sun. I shut down the computer and gathered my coat. The hallway outside was empty except for the echo of my steps. Downstairs, the air smelled of rain and stone. I walked to the corner and stopped at the crosswalk, the city lights flickering on one by one. Across the street, a group of students laughed as they ran for a bus, their voices carrying in the wind. I crossed slowly, taking in the rhythm of traffic and footsteps. The world felt ordinary again, and that was its own kind of miracle. For years, I had lived waiting for a single moment of reckoning. Now I understood that revenge was not the ending. It was the clearing of space for something truer to begin. At the river, I paused, leaning on the railing. The water moved beneath me, smooth and endless. Somewhere behind the skyline, the last trace of sunset faded. I whispered goodnight to my mom and thanked her for the strength she had given me. Before leaving, I took out my phone and recorded a short message for the Foundation's website. The light from the street lamps flickered across my face as I spoke. I said that the story of the fund began with loss, but ended with renewal. That the best kind of justice is one that builds rather than breaks, and that every woman who had been made to feel invisible deserved to be seen. Again. I ended by inviting anyone listening to share their own story of standing tall, after being silenced. When I stopped recording, the river sounded louder in the quiet. I slipped the phone into my coat pocket and began to walk home. Behind me, the city lights shimmered on the surface of the water, breaking into 1,000 pieces before coming together again. I looked once more over my shoulder and smiled at how beautiful it looked, how complete it felt, and kept walking until the noise of traffic swallowed the sound of my footsteps.